Okay, back to Mary. So Mary has now gone from Duketown from Chief Ehud. I think I might have mispronounced his name in the first lesson, but it's Ehud Honesty the Seventh. She's now gone into Old Town, and that's where she was when she left to go to Scotland. And then that's where the canoers came, and they wanted to take her to further into the Africa, and they wanted to take her to the tribe, the village called Ukayang, and that chief was Chief Edom. Well, Mary talked to Chief Honesty about it, and of course he told her no. But she said, I need to go. And she prayed about it and prayed about it. And she was told that this was, again, a very fierce village and she would face a lot of trials. Well, she decided, since they had asked and he had sent the men to come and gather her, she would go for a visit. She got there. She took a couple of her twins with her. And she got there and she met the chief's sister. Now, they call her Ma Edom. And later, we'll see how Ma and her, they just became best friends, and they themselves were on the mission of rescuing twins. Now, even though it had passed in Duketown and Old Town that twins were not to be killed, those laws did not translate or be transferred over into other villages. Each chief had to make those laws. And there was a lot of villages around that still killed twins. And Mary was still very concerned about that. She went there, and as she's going, she was wondering what she was going to be greeted by. When she got there, the chief and the village all were super happy to have her there. They had the children and they did their Bible lesson and she was able to teach them, and it just was wonderful. And she prayed about it and she kept thinking, all these people still haven't heard about Jesus. They're still following their religion of fear and witchcraft. She went back to Old Town and she told the chief there that she was going to go to Ukawang, and that's where God wanted her. So she packed up all her stuff and she went to go move. She knew that she probably would not be back to Old Town again. Now, when she got there this time, it was a little bit different. In fact, by the time they arrived, it was getting dark, and the men that ran the canoe would not take her all the way in. It was bad luck. So her and her children had to load the packages, all their belongings, and tote them through the trails, through the woods, all to get to the village. When they got there, there was no welcome. But she found a little hut that she thought that they told her would be hers, and they settled for the night. The very next morning, a young man, actually I take that back, that night, before they settled down, a young man named Ipke helped her get settled and moved into this hut. And the very next morning, when she got up, she heard all kinds of commotion. She went and she looked, and everyone was around. And there was the young man in the middle of this circle. And they were pouring hot oil over his arm. She went to go scream and stop him, stop! But it was too late. It was already done. The young boy fainted from the pain and from the shock. She went and she said, why? Why did you do this? And they said it was because the young man had swept out that empty hut, that he would have gathered up all the bad luck, all the bad spirits, and they had to burn the spirits out of him. Oh, you can imagine how Mary felt. And then her heart was broken, and she realized how badly these people needed to know Jesus and the love. And she realized that she had a lot to do to help these people to understand that witchcraft and fear was not the way to live. It wasn't too long that when the chief and the nearby was sick, and she was sent. When she got there, there was the witch doctor doing his thing, blowing smoke and dancing around, and dead chickens and all the things that they would do to try to scare away the bad spirits that were making the chief sick. But she instead gave him medicine. And it wasn't that long, and that chief was better. And she thought, haven't you learned anything yet? That witchcraft isn't going to heal you? And then she still had not met what supposedly the worst chief of them all. And that was Chief Nigeria. And one day, him and his men all trooped into their village, and they began to party. They began drinking, and you see, alcohol was a very big problem in this area. And they began drinking and partying, and the men, and they were getting so drunk, they were taking their knives and even hitting each other and cutting each other. Mary finally had had enough, and she marched up to this big old chief, looked up at him and said, "Leave! Get out of here!" Again, the chief didn't know what to say. He could have slashed her throat. He could have kicked her. He could have pushed her. Does this sound familiar? Does this remind you of a time when she was a young girl teaching a Bible lesson and had to stand up to a big bully? The chief, not knowing what to do, decided he'd do what this little lady told him to do. And he gathered up his men, and they began walking or stumbling out of the village. As they were stumbling along, they stopped and said, "We cannot go any further." There in the pathway was a bowl, had some leaves, some nuts, but then it had banana leaves all over it. They said they could not go any further because it would have been bad luck, that someone had put that there to put a spell on them, to anger the spirits. Well, Mary was not about to have them come back to the village, so she pushed her way through the men, and she kicked it all out of the way and said, "Go home." The men listened, but the next day they were back. They were so sick, and they said it was all because of Mary upsetting this pile of leaves, and there was a banana plant there as well, and they wanted that banana plant and all those things back so they could get rid of the evil spirit. Well, Mary looked at him and said, "You're not sick because of a banana plant. You are sick because you were drinking all night." The men would have nothing to do with it. Mary decided that this would be a time just to give them the banana plant. And it broke her heart that witchcraft and this fear had such a grip on people's life that they couldn't see the truth. She gave them the plant and she sent them home. And she continued to work hard. And her and Ma Edom continued to save twins. And often they even had a secret little code for each other. A runner would come and would have an empty medicine bottle, and the message would be, "Ma Edom needs some medicine." And Mary knew that meant Ma Edom needed her help to either save a twin or to help settle an argument to try to keep tribal wars. These people at this time, and again, a lot of it had to do with their not knowing God, not having religion, not the religion, but having a relationship and not knowing simple things from right and wrong. So they often would fight from village to village and kill people and drink and just not have much reasoning to what they were doing. They didn't know. No one had ever told them that, it's wrong to kill. They had not realized that they were precious in God's sight. And Mary had a hard road ahead of her, but she never shirked her responsibility. She never stopped sharing God's love. She never stopped standing up for what was right. Well, Mary, one night when she was praying, here comes a person yelling, saying, "We need medicine." And Mary went. And she prayed and prayed. And sure enough, the chief at that time, another chief that had been ill, was able to recover. Now, Chief Edom had long promised Mary a house. Here she was just in this little hut with the leaves coming down, and she needed a house, and she wanted a church so that they could have a building for when it rained, they wouldn't have to cancel services. Well, the chief had kept promising her this, but they never seemed to have the time to do it. So one day, Mary got out there and started gathering the mud and the straw, the dried weeds, and began making bricks. She had watched enough people to do it. She figured she could do it too. And it wasn't long, she was starting to build a house. The people looked at her and again, so astonished that this little woman could do anything. And then they also began to feel bad. And it wasn't long that people started helping her. And Mary then had a little house made of dried mud bricks with straw. So now she would be able to put her stuff in and the things that people would send to her without it all getting wet. And they got so excited that they began to build her a church. And Mary was even more pleased that now on Sunday they would be able to have church no matter what the weather. And here it was their first Sunday, and she thought, we should do something special. And she found a big, they called mission barrels at that time because that's what they sent things in, shipped things in, was barrels. And it was from Scotland, her church. And people had gathered up clothing and put it all in this mission barrel and had sent it to Mary. So Mary decided she was going to pass out these clothes and they would all go to church in these special clothes. Now, there wasn't enough clothes for everyone, but everyone had something. Some might have just had the hat. Some had a scarf. Some had just a little shirt over whatever else they were wearing. But they all had something new, and everyone, especially the children, got to march into church. Their new church, super excited to be able to wear something to this church. And Mary was so excited, and she told the people too, no weapons. There was to be no weapons brought into church. And people were gathering all around to hear the gospel now and also to see the church. More and more people were beginning to give up their witchcraft. Well, it was 2 years in the land of Ukawang had changed from a ferocious, unexplored area to a quiet village. And people were worshiping God and going to church and learning to read and learning to live a life that didn't involve being scared of spirits. Living a life that they didn't have to live constantly in fear. And Mary became very ill again. She was worn out. And a few days, it wasn't long, that the doctor said, you need to go back to Scotland and you need to get the proper rest. You need to get the proper food and medicine to recover or you're not going to make it. In fact, they even thought that at the time, the smallpox was even going around and they weren't even sure if that was indeed what Mary had. But a few days before she left, she and 3 of her twin children were walking through the jungle when Mary heard that blood-curdling sound. Again, a leopard was stalking them, practically treading on Mary's heels. She vowed later she felt his hot breath against her neck. But the children knew they did not dare run, or the leopard would think it was a game and chase them. So they did the next thing. They prayed. And God, Mary doesn't know how, but God somehow protected them from that leopard. Now, back at home in Scotland, as soon as Mary was well enough to get up and about, she was back at the churches, and she was teaching and telling them all about the things in Africa. People started coming around for miles and miles just to hear her. She became one of the most famous missionaries in Scotland at the time. And they said, if she would put out the plea, if you can help children, if you love them, you can help them, and you must come and start to work. And she would always challenge the people again. Start serving the Lord where you are, wherever you are, with whatever you have, that you need to just do what you can when you can, and God would help you. And so Mary ended up spending a year in Scotland to regain her health. And then she returned to Ecknage. And as soon as she got there, the first word she heard was, "Run, Ma, run." That was her signal. She was sent to work immediately. Ma Edom had sent a message with the empty medicine bottle telling her that she was needed. She got there, and there was 2 tribes that chief were trying to make war. And she knew if this happened, there would be hundreds of death, and if she could stop it, that would be the best thing. So Mary found out where their meeting was going to be, that they were going to discuss the terms. And she grabbed her bag of knitting, and then she went to sit in on this meeting. So here this little woman was in the meeting of these 2 big chiefs, and she was going to help them solve their problem. And as she listened to both sides, and they would talk, and they had heard of Mary's white wisdom and how smart this white Ma, as they called her, was. And these 2 men decided whatever she decided, they would abide. Well, Mary listened to both sides, and she helped them to solve their dispute, which was over land and who it belonged to, and the villages left in peace. And the whole time she was sitting there, she was knitting. Later on in Mary's biography, you can read how she said often she was so nervous and so scared that the knitting needles kept her hands from shaking. And so God used that in her life. So Mary, see here. Mary had drew the dividing lines of the land, and it wasn't long that even the British, who were controlling parts of Africa at this time, had heard of Mary, and they asked her to come help them. So Sir Claude MacDonald, he was the general of Duketown, and the missionaries often answered to them, and he was very grateful for them. And they said, "Oh, I'm sending soldiers into Okanagan Territory to enforce the law," one day is what he told Mary. "And I still hear of wars and terror." And Mary protested. She said, "It's too soon to do this. They are not ready. They will rebel against your soldiers, and many killings will happen. Give me time. I will help it." Sir Claude looked stern. "But my orders from Queen Victoria is to send in more soldiers to help settle these disputes." And Mary said, "I can do it." And so General MacDonald, instead of sending the 70 soldiers that he had planned on sending, sent Mary instead. And Mary was now a vice consul for Queen Victoria of the British Empire, and she went back to Okanagan and explained to the people. and that she traveled all over listening to their complaints and reviewing, kind of like what we would call today being a judge. Mary often heard talks of bandit women who rode and wait, let's just wait till next lesson to see what happens there.